Hi everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion here today. We are going to be answering the question, where is God in a coronavirus world? On our panel we've got Simon, we've got Miller, and we've got David. I will hand over to Simon to take it away.
So good evening everyone, and it's great to have you with us. What I'm going to do is just begin with a few kind of theological thoughts on where is God in a coronavirus world. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along in terms of using the chat facility on Zoom, which will give us some questions to think about as we go along. After I've spoken, then I'll hand over to Camilla and David, and they will share their thoughts, and then hopefully we can have a discussion around the things that come up. So, where is God in the coronavirus world? Well, what I think is really behind this question is the argument that if there is a God who is good and loving and all-powerful, as Christians believe, how can he allow evil and suffering in his world? Because a God who is all-powerful could remove evil and suffering if he wanted to. Therefore, if God is both good and all-powerful, there should be no evil or suffering in the world. However, there undeniably is evil and pain and suffering in the world, as we see in this coronavirus pandemic. Therefore, either God does not exist, or he's not good, or he's not powerful, or he just doesn't care. Now, if we kind of take that line of thinking, the first challenge to that approach is that if there is no God, the question we have to also answer is, where does all the good come from? Where does the love come from? The self-sacrifice, self-giving, our conscience, our desire for justice and moral behaviour. These actually don't make sense unless there is an ultimate good, an ultimate truth, an ultimate morality. And as Christians, we believe those ultimate things do exist and that they are God, they come from God. But the question around evil and suffering still remains. If there is a God, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there such things as COVID-19? So to answer that question, just a few thoughts around that. Firstly, without belittling the huge amount of pain and suffering that has happened around coronavirus and is still happening around coronavirus, I would want to say that actually what we're going through now is not unique, that we've been here before in terms of human experience. And I'm thinking, of course, of the plagues through Europe that literally decimated the population of Europe. I'm thinking of the flu pandemic in 1918. As humans, we've been in this situation before and have asked these questions before. Where is God when such things are happening? Secondly, I'd like to say I don't believe that suffering and pain is the way the world is meant to be. And I say that because it wasn't part of God's created order in Genesis. It's not part of what will be. The Bible gives us a picture of a new heaven and a new earth in Revelation chapter 21, I think, where there is no pain and no suffering and no tears. And I also say that because of the way that Jesus treated pain and suffering. Wherever he went, he constantly engaged with those who were in pain and who were suffering in a way to bring relief and hope and remove that pain and suffering. And I think one of the reasons he did that was as a pointer to how God's world was meant to be and will be. So suffering and evil, where does it come from? Well, Christians would say in part argument, or part answer to that argument, is that it comes into the world as a result of our rebellion against God, our refusal to live life according to his will and his way. And that's sin. And in terms of evil and suffering, that's one part of evil and suffering, and it's called moral evil. and it explains evil and suffering in terms of our choices and our refusal to live as God wants us to live. But there's also another type of evil and suffering recognized by Christians, and that's called natural evil. And that's harder to account for. A natural evil will be things like volcanic eruptions or earthquakes or tsunamis, something like COVID-19, cancer or some cancers and viruses that cause devastation. So part of that is natural evil. Interestingly, though, COVID-19 is a bit of both, because if human beings didn't treat animals the way they were treated in the wet markets, all mixed together and shipped over hundreds of miles so that their immune systems are suppressed, and then kept live in those markets, then perhaps we wouldn't be in the situation we are in. And if choices around how COVID-19 was dealt with in the first place, then again, we might not be in the situation that we are in now. But saying that, COVID-19 is still, it's a mixture of both moral and natural evil. So the question is still there, why does God allow moral evil to happen? Why does he allow human beings to make choices that can cause such pain and suffering in his world? What does that say about God? Well, the sort of classic Christian argument to that one is that God created human beings with free will, and one of the reasons he did that was so that we could love. If he could have made us like robots to completely obey him, but he did that, we couldn't choose him, and love is always a choice. So in creating us, God gave us the gift of free will so that we could love, we could choose God. But in doing so, he took the risk of us not choosing him, and in not choosing him, we get moral evil and the consequences of that. What do we do, or what does God do about suffering? And here I would include both moral evil and natural evil, which is harder, as I said earlier on, to account for and to explain. Evil and suffering can be used to draw us closer to Christ and to one another. That's been my own experience of suffering in my life. It's when I have drawn closest to God, I think, and found him there. And it's also brings the best out in others, as we see in our response to COVID-19. The things that we most applaud is the amazing self-sacrifice and giving of those who seek to meet people in their pain and suffering. Good can come out of it. Evil and suffering can bring the best out in us. It can lead us to mature and grow. Interesting enough, in the Bible, a lot of the words used are ones that imply some degree of suffering. And here I'm thinking of things like being pruned or passing through a furnace. So evil and suffering can help us to mature and grow in ways that can surprise us sometimes. Evil and suffering can reveal the truth, and it reveals that we are mortal, that there are bigger questions in life to think about than those that we so often are thinking about. It can reveal the truth of our society when we go through great times of evil and suffering, that we're relying on the wrong things and putting our priorities in the wrong things, and that maybe we need to be thinking about other things. And COVID-19 certainly has done some of that, I think. Suffering can bring about God's purposes, and that, when I say that, doesn't mean to say God is causing these things to happen. But actually, by bringing us close together as a community, helping us to serve one another and be more reflective about ourselves, evil and suffering can bring God's purposes about, make actually a better world. Another response to our evil and suffering is that God more than compensates for it. He helps us through it. It's his promise that he is with us in it, and that he offers us an eternity away from it. That evil and suffering, however terrible it is, isn't the end of our lives and what it means to be us. And that's part of what Christ came to show us. I think it's part of what the incarnation is all about, that Jesus came to live with us in our suffering, and to give us signs that that suffering is not the end, that there is more. And that's the whole point of his death and his resurrection, that there is more beyond our suffering, and that God actually is intimately involved in our suffering and cares about us as we go through that suffering. He doesn't just leave us alone, abandoned to it. So there's quite a lot in those brief thoughts about this huge subject, and I'm sure you've got lots of questions that you'd like following up. But before we go to those, maybe David and Camilla would like to say something, or I'll add it to over to one of them.
So, Miller, would you like to take it away?
Right. I just want to start by saying I am totally unqualified in any way, unlike Simon, to talk about this. I am really just, I am a committed Christian, but I have lots and lots of struggles and doubts, and have done for many years in my faith, probably more so as the years go on. So I just wanted to sort of put that out there, as it were. And also just to give a bit of personal background to that, about 10 years ago now, I was brought up as a Christian, but really only found my faith when I was in my early 20s. But about 10 years ago, I had a real faith crisis, brought on for all sorts of reasons. But one of them was to do with questions like that of suffering, and all sorts of questions about just how God worked in this world and what his sovereignty meant in practice, but also watching the suffering of somebody I love very much also brought on this crisis. And it lasted about a year, and I sought God over it, and I read so many things, and I never really got what I would call a satisfactory answer. So that's kind of my answer today, is that I believe that God is so much bigger than us, bigger than our brains, that these questions, these difficult questions of suffering are unanswerable in a way, and that we sometimes too much try and bring God down to our own level and talk about him as if he was another human being with the same thoughts and thought processes and motivations and whatever else. And he's infinitely greater than that, infinitely more. He's just totally beyond our understanding in so many ways. And the strange thing is that coming to this conclusion nearly 10 years ago, rather than pushing me away from God, somehow actually enabled me to draw closer to him, to reach out to God on a deeper level, not on a sort of just on a much deeper level, and to experience him and his love in everything, in everyday life. And recently I happened to read something that summed it up, that I just want to read to you now, and then I'm actually going to finish, which for me is the answer to where is God in a coronavirus world. This was written by, it's actually saying what I've just tried to say. It's written by a chap called John Winnegards, who was a professor at the Ministry Institute of London. But he says, God is the innermost mystery of our lives. God sustains us in being who we are. He pervades our world as the foundation of truth, the source of all beauty, the love that gives meaning to our existence. Without directly meddling in our day-to-day lives as a super manager who inflicts disease on sinners or who grants rain to believers in a period of drought. And to me, that sums it up. You know, I don't think God sent coronavirus to us. I really don't. I think it's part of God's creation. He created this world, and it self-sustains, and this virus is part of that. But he is there in it all, and he's with us all the time, in everything, in every act of love that we experience or that we offer, or in suffering and in pain, he's there. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Excellent. David, over to you.
Well, thank you. I'm really not quite sure where I should start. So when this happens, I usually just start speaking and hope that I end up where I'm meant to have been. I've got a lot of thoughts going through my mind right now, but I think it's probably relevant to say that I'm a Christian. I have a very strong faith in Jesus, but I became a Christian when I was 30. And so in my young adult years, I had no faith at all. And one of the barriers to that was I'm a doctor, so as a young doctor, I saw a huge amount of suffering. I saw a lot of really unfair things. I remember, people younger than I am now, but too young to die, dying of horrible diseases, and I just could not get my head round, well, how on earth, if there is this loving God, how do these things happen? And shortly before my wife and I got married, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which can be a really, really horrible disease. How does that work? And thankfully, she's actually done really, really well now, 33 years later. But these are real barriers, and if God is all powerful and he can decide to make things happen or not, it's really, really difficult. And my head could not get around it at all. But I became a Christian when I was 30. That's a whole nother story, which we haven't got time for. And what happened thereafter was that once I had that relationship with God, and once I really understood what it was all about, those questions just disappeared. Because what I derived from my relationship with God was just so awesome. So his peace, the joy. I remember thinking he added a whole new dimension to my life that just wasn't there before. And suffering was still there, but when it impacted me personally, either through illness within my family, or other things, I had this sense. I was able to manage it so much better because I knew God was there and giving me a source of strength, taking me through it. So to answer the question, where is God in the coronavirus world? Well, he's with us, and he's available to us, whoever we are, even if we don't think of ourselves as a Christian, if we ask for him to be with us, he'll be with us. And from my own experience, it is transformational, and it provides that level of comfort, that level of support in times of suffering. And so I guess we're living in a wonderful part of the world. We've been in this lockdown situation. We've been deprived of all sorts of things, but it's mitigated by the wonderful situation we're living in. But we have to be aware there are people in this country, and probably not too far away, who really are suffering through what's been happening in recent weeks. Whether they've been ill themselves, whether they've experienced a loved one die, or whether they've lost their job or whatever. There is huge suffering going on, and I still haven't got an answer as to why it's happening in terms of faith and in terms of God. But I think a bit like Milla, you were saying, I don't believe that we're meant to understand all these things. God by definition he's not like us. He's supernatural. So I think there are some things about God that we're not meant to understand. Now, that might not bring very much comfort to people who really are suffering and who are asking the sort of questions that I was asking 30 odd years ago. But if people can sort of find space to bring God into that suffering, then I genuinely feel that it can help, as help each individual. And then finally, in the point I think that Simon made about God can help us out of suffering, or he can his goals or his aims can be fulfilled sometimes through suffering. I have absolutely no doubt, notwithstanding a lot of people have suffered really badly in our suffering, that as a result of what we're going through, the world is going to be better in a whole, all sorts of ways, whether it's the environment, whether it's us being made to realize what really is important in life, and in all sorts of ways. I think the better things will come out of it. And I guess the very final point, of course, is that Jesus suffered like none of us has. He died on the cross, a horrible death. And I think, therefore, he does understand us in our suffering. And I'll stop there.
I think that's a good jumping off point to move slightly from, there are lots of kind of follow-up theological questions, which I think would be interesting to delve into, but it would also be interesting to look at it from a slightly different angle as well of, as a Christian, how has that affected your experience of this coronavirus crisis? So kind of where has God been kind of on a more personal level with you kind of through this crisis? I guess going in the same order. So Simon, if you've got any thoughts on that.
Well, my thoughts on that probably follow on from what David just said, is that whenever I think about suffering, I do think about Christ's experience of life and death and resurrection. He was fully engaged in all of those parts of that. And so when I think about what's coming out of coronavirus, I see and acknowledge the huge amount of suffering that's happened and is yet to happen on different levels as well. I believe profoundly that God is in that and will work for good to come out of that. So I look for it in terms of, so in the village, for example, how we, how people have stood up to care for one another and just do things like shopping for complete strangers, all those kind of things. How perhaps people are thinking more about the environment and, do we need to drive everywhere for our meetings, all those kind of things. I'm thinking about how people are talking about being kind to one another on a national level as well. I'm hoping that we will see more kindness in our politics and those kind of things. But I, as both Camilla and David said, I don't have the answers, but I do believe that God wants absolutely what is best for us. And even when things seem to be going off the rails, he can bring things out of that. So, I haven't got a crystal ball that I can look into and say this is going to happen and that's going to happen. But as a Christian, my experience has been, looking back on my own life, God has worked good out of suffering in my life at different levels, and I believe he can do that for us as human beings across the planet. I'll stop there.
Okay, Miller, kind of anything to kind of add on that, how it's affected your experience of this?
Well, personally, I suppose, it's been a really unsettling time, hasn't it? All our routines have been taken away. Some days seem like a week, and then some days just sort of go past in a blur, and I sort of think, what have I done all day? It's a kind of a weird time. But I've had more time to ponder what's important in life, and I think a lot of people might that I've spoken to have said the same. So for me, I have tried to spend more time with God, but also just thinking about what's important. Not being able to go shopping and consume things is a great thing, isn't it? the beauty of creation and spring. I mean, what a wonderful time to have been corralled and not being able to go out. And it's just, again, sort of drawn me to nature and to God, the creator of nature. This something I've always been aware of, that the importance of community, but just how uplifting it has been to feel part of community and to see community breaking out right across the country. Yeah, so without doubt, there have been great silver linings to this virus. Yeah, great, thanks.
Fantastic, David. Anything to add?
So, yeah, I think your question was about how this period has affected how we thought of God or our relationship with God.
Yes. So, well, how your relationship with God has affected your experience of the crisis compared.
Right.
To
Fair enough. Yes. Okay. I think because, in all honesty, apart from a few times when I did get very frustrated about everything being shut down and the trains not working and what have you, I don't feel I've suffered at all during this lockdown. And I feel very privileged and very lucky to be able to say that. There's actually been a huge number of blessings, spending more quality time at home and with my wife, and we're not rushing around doing things because we're not allowed to do the sort of things that we'd want to rush around and do. Being in nature, hearing the birds, we don't have a huge number of aeroplanes flying over here anyway, but and seeing all the things that Miller has mentioned also, the community spirit, so I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I guess in a sense, how has my faith influenced how I've responded to it? It's been, I guess, that it has made me very much aware of all the beauty of God's creation, all the beauty of what we have around us, and of all the positive aspects of human nature. There's people have mentioned the kindness, and almost a sense of a community that actually, well, this is probably how we should be living. We should be just going to our nearest shops to buy the food that we need, and because that helps build the community, it helps sustain the community.
Wonderful. As we kind of approach the end of our time, I think a kind of nice question to kind of get towards closing is, as all of you have kind of mentioned, there's lots of positives that we'd like to think going forwards and kind of ways society can improve and learn from this. What role do you think that Christians and the church kind of have in those next steps? In the same order again, Simon.
Ooh, well, I would like to think that Christians will be at the forefront of those changes on every level. So we should be encouraging and enabling community to happen. I mean, because obviously Christians don't have the monopoly on what it means to love or be kind or to create community. But we can help to be at the forefront of that, to use our buildings, coordinate things as we have done here, all that kind of thing, and model what it's like to be kind and loving and generous to people. I think we need to be at the forefront of working for a healthy planet and what that looks like, and keep raising that flag really where we can. We should be challenging our politicians and leaders to be leading wisely and generously. I mean, I spoke earlier on about COVID-19 revealing truths. Well, one of the truths it has revealed, and David touched upon this, is that we live in a society that is divided at different levels. Christians should be trying to create communities that are healing those divisions. So I'd like to see us at the forefront of that, of seeing the things that COVID-19 has revealed and where they require healing is speaking into those things. That's what Jesus did. I mean, that's basically everything he did, was bringing people in who weren't on the boat, as it were, and making them feel loved and wanted, and giving them a voice. And I hope that that's where the church will be at the front of that.
Miller, kind of continuing on that kind of thought of where do Christians kind of stand in the next steps we need to take as a society to kind of learn and grow from this pandemic?
Right. I'm not sure I've got very much to add to what Simon said. Just to echo that obviously Christians don't have any sort of monopoly on any of these issues going forward, and a lot of them have been raised in the press. But I personally feel that two things that this crisis has sort of revealed to us are, one, that the issue of climate change and pollution, and there is so much that's said everywhere is so much nicer now. We're not doing all doing all the stuff we have been doing, and I think as we rebuild, we really need to Christians and non-Christians alike think about how we can rebuild for a greener future. But also I think COVID has highlighted issues of inequality, and it is the poorest and those with least resources that have suffered the most. David was saying he doesn't feel like he suffered very much from this crisis, and I could very much say the same. But that, as he said, there are a lot of people who have suffered a lot, and they're very often, they're usually and often the poorest in our societies. And I think as Christians, we have a responsibility to try and keep raising those issues, and the valuing of our key workers, who are and care workers, who are these lowly paid people in low status jobs, and yet who have been the heroes of this whole crisis. I hope we learn from that.
Fantastic. David, anything to add on that topic? I appreciate it's kind of limited.
Well, just to follow on, I'm afraid I think it's the case that there is going to be a huge amount of more suffering coming on as we come out of this crisis. Not so much health suffering, but financial suffering, unemployment. The disparities and the deprivations will be made worse, and money is going to run out. So I think the challenge really for Christians individually, but perhaps also the church, however you define that, is to be as relevant as possible in that situation. And I would very much hope that the church will be out there, not just speaking out and being a voice for those who will be suffering, but actually doing really good practical stuff to help alleviate it. I don't think parts of the church that see their role as sort of putting on a nice Sunday service and then that's it. I don't think that's going to cut it. I think people are really going to be looking, and people are looking. Apparently, the Google searches for church and prayer and all the rest of it are skyrocketing. The attendance at church online is far greater than the real people, bums on seats in churches. So there is I think people will be looking to see how the church will respond, and that would really be my wish, that it responds in a way that is really relevant to what the new reality will be.
Fantastic. Are there any more kind of responses to those last points raised? If not, I will hand it over to Simon to close this out.
No.
Seems like it's all yours, Simon.
Okay, well, all I want to do is just say a huge thank you to all of you who joined us for this. A huge thank you to David and to Camilla for being a support and encouragement to me, because we never quite know what's going to happen when we do these things. Thank you to Sam for managing the technology, which is the scariest bit of everything. Thank you for doing that. If you have any more questions as a result of the things that were said tonight, you know, things you might disagree with, or things you want more information on, or you just want to talk more about, then please be in contact with me. You know, I'd be quite happy to. I was going to say meet for a coffee and have a chat, but I don't know how we do that now. I can come around your garden and keep 2 meters away from you and we can talk, but I'm quite happy to do that.